Welcome to PenGen's Inkwell podcast. My name is Jen Waters. I hope you enjoy my stories. The Orchestra's Tale is the first story on the 10-track children's music and spoken word Apple Music release Impossible Things, which came out in October 2017. When Impossible Things was released, I was so excited because I had just gone through a skin and nipple sparing mastectomy of the right breast for DCIS microinvasion breast cancer, the smallest amount of invasive cancer before stage 1. I was recuperating for most of the summer, so the recording for the release had been finished before I had the May 2017 diagnosis. Until November 2018, I was in process of rebuilding my right breast through multiple stem cell breast reconstruction surgeries with Dr. Joel Aronowitz in the West Cedars Tower in Los Angeles. In summer of 2017, I had started recording the songs for the singer-songwriter release Simplicity. Then Simplicity was released on April 2nd, 2019, and I was re-diagnosed with DCIS in my left breast by July 2019. And I had a second skin and nipple sparing mastectomy of the left breast in August 2019. But Curiouser and Curiouser came out December 10th, 2019, because we kept recording the stories anyhow through the stem cell breast reconstruction process. Months before, when I wrote The Orchestra's Tale in November 2014, I decided I wanted to write something like Toy Story, a multi-character story. I have a Toy Story puzzle, and I looked at it one day and thought, what if I used the characters of the orchestra the way that the toys are used in Toy Story? So I made up The Orchestra's Tale and linked it to composer Giuseppe Tartini and Johann Sebastian Bach. I used the clarinet and the violin as two of the main characters because my great-grandfather, Robert Moyer, played the clarinet in Brown's Lutheran Church Band in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, and my grandmother, Augusta Renner Groff Waters, owned a conservatory violin. My family still has those instruments sitting on the piano that I played growing up. Then I suggested scoring The Orchestra's Tale to Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. In high school, I played that piece on the piano on Christmas Eve in church. I remember being so nervous, but from where I sat at the piano bench, I couldn't see the congregation, so that helped. Later, I decided that singing was a better idea than just playing the piano, so I sang Amy Grant's Breath of Heaven at Christmas, which was a big hit with the church members. Aside from Toy Story, I also always loved how Tom Hanks voiced 5 characters in The Polar Express. So when I started recording my own short stories, I decided to perform multiple voices the same way Tom Hanks portrayed the Polar Express. Now, here's The Orchestra's Tale. I hope you enjoy it. Giuseppe the violin and Johann the flute are sick of sitting on the shelf. Years ago, famous musicians Giuseppe Tartini and Johann Sebastian Bach played the 2 instruments for adoring crowds. When retired conductor Franz Melodia of the Luneburg Symphony Orchestra lost his funding, he could no longer put on performances for the community. Even his son, George, had become more interested in his electronic instruments and never played the violin and the flute. "Dad, I like the electric guitar," he said. Sadly enough, if Franz could not get the orchestra back on its feet, he would have to sell the instruments and work at the local butcher shop. "I hate pork. Pork chops, pork loin, bacon bits, pork rib, pork leg, and glazed ham. I feel like I've been shopped." Each time Franz tried to talk to his son about learning to play Giuseppe and Johann, George put on his earphones and drowned out his father. "What did you say, Dad?" George said, turning up the volume. "I can't hear you." Despite the orchestra's bleak future, Franz kept Giuseppe and Johann on his living room mantel hoping for a financier for the orchestra. Giuseppe and Johann had been sitting on the mantel for so long that dust built up in the instrument's crevices.
I want to scratch an itch, but I can't even do that from the shelf, Giuseppe said. I can't imagine how the rest of the orchestra feels shoved into the closet. Clara must be out of tune with worry,
Johann said. Months ago, Franz boxed up the other instruments and put them in his hall closet, including Pablo the piccolo, Ole the oboe, Robert the bassoon, Richard the double bassoon, Fanny the French horn, Peter the trumpet, David the trombone, Antonio the tuba, Sebastian the saxophone, Wolfgang the viola, Ludwig the cello, Libby the double bass, Amy the piano, Elizabeth the harp, Arcangelo the timpani, Frederic the xylophone, Sergei the cymbals, Mishka the triangle, Gustav the snare drum, Nicolo the bass drum, Augusta the tambourine, Ruth the maracas, Joan the gongs, and Jennifer the chimes. Only Clara the clarinet had broken out of her box to come visit Giuseppe and Johann on the shelf.
"Me love,"
she said to Johann, kissing his mouthpiece.
"But I must go before Franz finds me."
Once upon a time, she and Johann played gorgeous duets and were madly in love ever since their first solos. As time passed, Giuseppe and Johann decided that they would have to organize the return of the Luneburg Symphony Orchestra by themselves.
Synthesized music is not going to destroy the orchestra, Giuseppe said. Clara can't live in the closet anymore. True love demands that we are together, Johann said. When Franz and George take their annual summer vacation, we're organizing the revival of the orchestra, and that is the final note, Giuseppe said.
After Franz and George packed their bags for Blue Mountain Lake, Giuseppe and Johann snuck the orchestra out of the closet to the Luneburg Symphony Concert Hall. One at a time, the instruments slipped through the hall's backstage door and waited in the wings. Despite the exhausted instruments, Giuseppe demanded the orchestra perfect enough material for an entire concert.
We are an orchestra and we are going to sound like one. Without musicians to play us, we will play ourselves, Giuseppe said.
At first, the orchestra sounded terrible, trying to pluck their own strings and play their own notes. But Giuseppe and Johann insisted that practice makes perfect. So the orchestra played until they overcame their problems, and Bach's Sonata in G minor sounded especially spectacular. Days later, when Franz and George returned from their vacation, Franz found his closet door open.
Oh me, oh my, the instruments are missing. Giuseppe, Johann, where are you?
Franz cried, reaching for the phone.
Police, get over here quick! Someone stole my orchestra. Finding an orchestra of instruments is not going to be a priority, the police officer said. I have real criminals to catch. I will offer a reward, Franz said. $2,000 to the person who finds them.
Are you sure the instruments are really worth $2,000, Dad? George said after Franz hung up the telephone.
If I get the instruments back, I'm keeping the reward money, he told George. I'm selling those stupid instruments to the highest bidder and putting the past in the past.
In the meantime, the orchestra hid out at the concert hall and advertised their upcoming Sunday afternoon show.
We're never leaving the stage again. Never, ever, Giuseppe said to Johann.
Walking to the butcher the next morning, Franz was stunned to find a flyer for the Sunday concert.
I'm buying 2 tickets to the Luneburg Symphony Concert Hall show. I'm going to find out who stole my instruments, he mumbled. As the Sunday performance began, Franz shifted in his seat, astounded to find his instruments playing themselves on stage to a sold-out show. Clenching his program, Franz could hardly sit still until the performance finished, holding George by his suspenders to keep him from rushing the stage. "You can't interrupt the show, son," Franz whispered. "It will only make things worse." "But, Dad, how did Giuseppe and Johann get up there without us?" George said. "Son, I had no idea what the orchestra was capable of performing," Franz said, tearing up. The pitch-perfect show ended to a standing ovation with several rounds of applause. "Do you know who that is, George?" Franz said, almost passing out when he recognized audience member Jonathan Bach II, a long-lost relative of Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach II clapped from the front row with his wife and 3 children. "The violin superb, the flute divine," Bach II cheered, taking the stage. "I will finance the orchestra, refurbish the concert hall, and conduct the performances. These are my family's instruments. They are my inheritance. Solos for Giuseppe, duets with Johann and Clara." "Maybe I shall learn to play the violin and the flute after all," George said, curling up in his chair. "The orchestra has come back to life," Franz said, running to Jonathan and hugging him in tears. From then on, Giuseppe and Johann played beautiful music, and the whole world knew the orchestra's tale.
This has been Pen Jen's Inkwell Podcast. I wrote and performed all the original stories in the podcast. This podcast is produced by Eric Baines, who scored all the stories and poems in the series to original and public domain music. The podcast is associated with my blog of the same name, Pen Jen's Inkwell, which can be found on my website, jenwaters.com.